What if the official in charge of immigration enforcement suddenly lost their job? What if the government could deport someone by putting them on a plane and sending them to a country they've never even stepped foot in? And what if the president could launch military strikes without Congress formally approving it? These aren't hypothetical questions. These are real legal battles happening right now in courts and in Congress. That's what we are breaking down today on Wahl on Law. Hello, and welcome to the 5th episode of Wahl on Law. My name is Jonas Wahl, and I am a sophomore at the University of Delaware studying political science, sociology, and criminal justice. I created this podcast because there are major legal updates every week that affect our lives, and as a student, I didn't always understand what those changes meant for me. Wahl on Law breaks down how the law actually shows up in everyday life, especially for students, young people, and non-lawyers. In today's episode, we are covering 3 major legal updates. First, we'll look at President Trump's firing of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and the legal powers presidents have over cabinet officials. Then, we'll break down a federal judge's decision that blocked a Trump administration immigration policy, allowing migrants to be deported to foreign countries. And finally, we'll discuss Congress's attempt to limit President Trump's authority to continue military strikes against Iran and what that vote reveals about the long-running constitutional debate over war powers. Let's start with a major development inside the executive branch. On Thursday, March 5th, President Donald Trump fired Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem after months of controversy surrounding her leadership of the Department of Homeland Security. Noem had been one of the most visible figures in the administration's immigration crackdown, frequently appearing in media and on social platforms defending aggressive enforcement policies. But her tenure came under increasing scrutiny in recent weeks. Members of Congress from both parties criticized a $220 million advertising campaign connected to the Department of Homeland Security that prominently featured Noem and had reportedly been awarded without a standard competitive bidding process, where the government normally lets multiple companies compete for the contract. At the same time, lawmakers were investigating 2 fatal shootings of U.S. citizens by federal immigration officers in Minneapolis. Early statements from the department labeled the individuals as domestic terrorists, but later video evidence raised serious questions about that claim, increasing public backlash and pressure from Congress over how the department was being run. All of this created mounting pressure on the administration, and on March 5th, President Trump announced that he was removing Noem from her position. He also said he plans to nominate Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin to replace her, a nomination that will require confirmation by the U.S. Senate. If approved, he would become the official in charge of the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees immigration enforcement, border security, and national security. Now, at first glance, this may sound like just another political shakeup inside a presidential administration, but there's an important legal principle behind it. Cabinet secretaries, including the Secretary of Homeland Security, are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate under what's known as the Appointments Clause in Article 2 of the Constitution. However, once they are confirmed, they ultimately serve at the pleasure of the president, meaning the president can remove them from office. That power to remove executive officials has been recognized by the Supreme Court for more than a century, with courts generally concluding that the president must have the ability to remove top executive officers in order to effectively control the executive branch. At the same time, the replacement process still requires Senate confirmation, which reflects the constitutional system of checks and balances. So in this case, while the president was able to immediately remove Noem from office, the person who replaces her will still need approval from Congress before taking the position permanently. This moment also highlights another important part of the constitutional system. Congressional oversight. Much of the pressure leading up to Noem's removal came from congressional hearings, investigations, and criticism from lawmakers questioning the department's actions and spending. Congress cannot directly fire executive officials, but through oversight hearings, funding decisions, and political pressure, lawmakers can still play a powerful role in holding the executive branch accountable. In other words, this story isn't just about one cabinet secretary losing her job. It's another example of how the Constitution distributes power across the branches of government, giving the president control over the executive branch while allowing Congress to scrutinize and influence how that power is used. And like many disputes in government, the tension between executive authority and congressional oversight is something we see play out again and again. Okay, now let's move on to a separate ruling from a federal judge. On Wednesday, February 25th, a federal judge ruled that the Trump administration had adopted an unlawful policy allowing for the rapid deportation of migrants to countries other than their own without giving them a meaningful opportunity to object or raise concerns about their safety. Let's break this down. The policy the federal judge was referring to involves the government's practice of removing migrants to what are known as third countries. In other words, instead of deporting someone back to the country they originally came from, immigration authorities may send them to a different country that is willing to accept them. Supporters of this policy argue that it helps immigration authorities more quickly process deportations, especially in situations where migrants cannot easily be returned to their home country due to diplomatic issues, lack of documentation, or refusal by those governments to accept them. However, critics argue that the policy creates serious risks for migrants because being sent to a random country you've never lived in is not exactly the kind of surprise travel experience most people are hoping for. In some cases, individuals may be sent to countries where they have no family connections, no legal status, and potentially face violence, persecution, or unsafe conditions. The federal judge ruled that the administration's process violated federal immigration law and basic due process protections because migrants were not given a meaningful chance to challenge their removal before being sent to these third countries. Specifically, the court found that migrants must be given an opportunity to explain why deportation to a country could put them in danger. For example, if they fear torture or other serious harm. The judge concluded that by rapidly deporting migrants to third countries without allowing them to raise these safety concerns, the administration's policy failed to meet those legal requirements. As a result, the court ordered the government to stop implementing the policy in its current form unless migrants are given a fair opportunity to challenge where they are being sent. Now, this ruling does not stop deportations altogether. The government can still remove migrants from the United States, but it must follow procedures that allow individuals to raise safety concerns before being sent to another country. So, why does this matter? Because immigration enforcement is not just about who can stay in the United States. It's also about how the government carries out deportations and what legal protections migrants are entitled to during that process. This decision highlights an ongoing legal tension between the government's authority to enforce immigration laws and the constitutional protections that apply to people facing removal. And like many immigration cases, this ruling could ultimately be appealed and move through the federal court system, meaning the issue may not be fully resolved for quite some time. Okay, now let's move on to a final major development in Congress regarding U.S. military action in Iran. On Wednesday, March 4th, the U.S. Senate voted 53-47 to block a bipartisan resolution that would have limited President Donald Trump's ability to continue military strikes against Iran without approval from Congress. Let's break this down. Right now, the United States and Israel are engaged in a rapidly escalating military conflict with Iran. The crisis began in late February when U.S. and Israeli forces launched a large series of airstrikes targeting Iranian military infrastructure and senior leadership in Tehran. One of the most dramatic developments was the killing of Iran's longtime supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in those strikes, which was a major shock to Iran's political system because he had ruled the country since 1989. Since then, the conflict has expanded across the region. Iran has launched retaliatory missile and drone attacks against Israeli targets, U.S. military bases in the Middle East, and infrastructure in neighboring countries. The fighting has also disrupted global shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important routes for the world's oil supply. The situation remains highly volatile, with both sides trading attacks and the risk of a broader regional war continuing to grow. And that's exactly where Congress comes in. Under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, Congress has the authority to force a vote requiring the president to withdraw U.S. forces from military conflicts that lawmakers have not formally authorized, like the conflict in Iran. The measure was backed primarily by Democrats, along with a small number of Republicans. Their argument was that the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the authority to declare war, and therefore the administration should not be able to continue a military campaign against Iran without approval from lawmakers. However, a majority of senators ultimately voted to not advance the resolution, blocking it and allowing the president's military campaign to continue without new congressional authorization. Supporters of the administration argued that the president already has enough authority as commander-in-chief to conduct military operations, particularly during active conflicts or when responding to threats against the United States and its allies. Critics, on the other hand, say the vote reflects a broader pattern where Congress has increasingly given its constitutional war power to the executive branch over the past several decades. Presidents from both parties have often found ways to move forward with military action anyway, which has also led some critics to joke that the War Powers Resolution is more of a strongly worded suggestion. The War Powers Resolution was designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Under the law, the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying forces and must withdraw them after 60 days or 90 days, unless Congress formally authorizes the action. However, in practice, presidents from both parties have often continued military operations without explicit declarations of war, and Congress has rarely used the War Powers Resolution to stop them. So, why does this matter? Because this vote highlights an ongoing constitutional debate about who has the power to take the United States into war, the president or Congress. While the Constitution clearly grants Congress the power to declare war, modern presidents have increasingly relied on their authority as commander-in-chief to launch military operations without formal approval from lawmakers. This tension between the executive and legislative branches has been building for decades, and moments like this show just how difficult it can be for Congress to reassert its authority once military action is already underway. And with conflicts around the world continuing to evolve, the balance of power over war-making authority is likely to remain one of the most significant debates in the American government. So that brings us to the big picture. All three of the stories we covered today are really about the same underlying question: who holds power, and what limits does the law place on that power? In the first story, we looked at how the Constitution gives the president the power to remove top executive officials, while the Senate still has a role in approving their replacements. In the second case, a federal judge stepped in to determine how far the government can go when enforcing immigration laws and deporting people from the country. And in the third story, Congress and the president are once again debating who has the authority to take the United States into war. These cases may seem unrelated at first, but they all reflect a core function of the legal system: setting boundaries on government authority and determining how constitutional rights are applied in real-world situations. And importantly, none of these issues are fully settled yet. The leadership change at the Department of Homeland Security still requires Senate confirmation for a permanent replacement. The immigration case will likely continue through the appeals process. And the debate over war powers between Congress and the president has been going on for decades. That means the legal landscape around these issues could still evolve in the months and years ahead. But that's exactly why following legal developments like these matters. The law isn't just something that exists in textbooks or courtrooms. It shapes public policy, government power, and everyday life. Before we close out, I want to say thank you for listening to the 5th episode of Wahl on Law. If you found this episode helpful, or if it helped make the law feel a little more understandable, that's exactly the goal of this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow or subscribe to Wahl on Law so you don't miss future updates. You can also find episode summaries and more information at wahlonlaw.com. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Wahl on Law.